Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the IFAM seminar series today. I'm Ron Ackerman, the director for the Institute for Public Health and Medicine at Northwestern University. I'd like to take a moment in terms of housekeeping to firstly welcome our online participants today, and to please be aware, as the moderator has put into the chat, that we don't monitor the chat during the meeting. So if you have questions of the speaker, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom panel. You can enter a question at any point during the presentation, and at the end, time permitting, we will go through the questions and ask our presenter today to answer them. I'm delighted that our presenter today is Dr. Andrew Papachristos, who is the John G. Searle Professor of Sociology at Northwestern University and Director for the Institute for Policy Research. Dr. Papachristos is a Chicago native and one of the world's leading experts at applying network science to the study of crime, violence, policing, and urban neighborhoods. His talk today is titled Blueprints for Safety: Engaged Science and the Story of Collaborative Gun Violence Prevention in Chicago. He will talk about and discuss the lessons learned over the past 5 years from collaborative community-engaged gun violence prevention efforts here in our city. And without further delay, please join me in welcoming our presenter, Dr. Andrew Papachristos.
Thank you, everyone, and I'm envisioning applause in my ears after that lovely introduction. Ron, thank you for that, and it's really great to be here, actually be back. I think I gave a talk here right when I first arrived at Northwestern, and I'll do some additional thanks along the way. I'll say that this is a new talk, and it's an effort really to think through work that's been going on in Chicago since 2016, and that I've been involved with since even before I came back to Chicago in 2018, from a decade plus on the East Coast. So bear with the sort of the usual new talk kind of hiccups, if you will, but I'm really excited to kind of walk through this narrative. And the title is really indicative of what I really want to do, which is talk about something that's been built in our city, which is actually now currently being almost a national model for how we think about civilianized approaches to public safety. And so let's see if technology cooperates. But in 2020, I think probably most of you know, the country as a whole experienced its largest single year increase in gun violence at about 35%. And we reached levels of gun homicides and non-fatal shootings that we actually haven't seen since the 80s. That's really significant for all sorts of reasons. It's since gone down. We're not at pre-COVID levels everywhere, but some cities have gotten there. But this most recent spike in violence unfolded during a very particular unique moment, which we all recall, right? Which is COVID pandemic itself, but also the continued wrestling with the inequalities of the criminal justice system, and especially policing responses. The murder of George Floyd, Michael Brown, we can think of the names and add them all to this list. But this most recent spike in 2020 didn't happen, in a normal time period, as it were. It happened as the country as a whole was wrestling with how we respond to crime and violence. And many cities in this country, but not all, actually did something different when they were looking for solutions to gun violence, which is rather than go back to or continue or amplify even further the sort of get tough on crime, law and order position, this country saw an increase in investments in what we call community violence interventions, or what I'm going to call CVI. It's what we now call CVI. And CVIs are actually community-centered efforts to reach individuals who are actively involved in gun violence and try to direct them to life-saving services or have other types of interventions, ranging from mediations between gangs shooting each other to cognitive behavioral therapy, transitional jobs, other sorts of things. But the idea was to use, hire, train, and invest in local organizations, often those with lived experience with the justice system and gun violence, and use that as a way to intervene in shootings that are going on today. As I'm going to talk about later, it's actually an old idea, but this was a thing that as a whole, cities and the United States as a whole started to invest in. So in Chicago, just three examples of some of our partners I'll talk about throughout: the Institute for Nonviolence, Breakthrough, Chicago Cred. We started seeing different programs and organizations really kind of picking up steam during this era. But that's not all that happened. In fact, one of the things that happened, which is what the title is a nod to, is that these disparate organizations started collaborating and building in very new and unique ways. They went from just organizations and programs peppered throughout cities to actually people coordinating pay scales, services, resources, training. They developed systematic training and started certifications, for example. So much so that for the first time in this country's history, it's brand new, we have a White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention. Now it's brand new. There's only a handful of people in this office, but it really goes in a short period of time, in less than 5 years, from having a bunch of programs to having a federal office. And there's a lot of other things that actually happened in this space. So what I want to talk about today was about my experience over these last 5 years building partnerships through my own research center, Corners, the Center for Neighborhood Engaged Research and Science, which lives inside of IPR. And our partnerships with various city, state, civic partners and organizations, and here are some of them. Because we've been here from day one, if not day three, for some of these entities, and really we approach the research in a very different way, which is through community engaged processes. And I'm happy to talk about that in greater detail as we go along or in the Q&A. But basically what that meant was we were in partnership from start to finish. There's no finish, it seems like, for this work, but from start to the process, building the design together, doing the research together, writing the papers together, figuring out new ways to get findings back quickly so that people can really understand it. Because as this attention and investment happened, even before the ink was dry on grants and people could hire people, everybody wanted the answer to this question. Does it work? Does this non-police intervention, which everybody's talking about, does it work? And this question started to create a lot of tension and fear in organizations, rightfully so, which we'll talk about in a moment. Because how do you evaluate the efficacy of programs that haven't even existed or don't exist or are just getting started, as opposed to have, say, as many of you in this workshop know, a fully thought out and piloted model? People wanted a report card before it could kind of happen. And what we couldn't answer and haven't been able to answer for the whole history of these programs are things like, what is the work? How many workers are there? What are they doing? How often do they do it? How many people do they connect with? So we were trying to answer an impact question, one that funders and politicians cared a lot about, especially, and avoiding the questions that many of the practitioners really wanted to know about, which is, how do we do our jobs? Which way are we doing the jobs? Which things are most efficacious, but actually, how do we expand and increase our capacity? And so the approach that I'm going to talk about today really tried to understand both of these questions in concert. So here's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to talk about the creation of this movement, and it is very much a social movement as much as it is a particular moment in our city's history and country's history. I'll spend some time talking about the engaged research design that we use at Corners. And then I'm actually going to go through the research. It's sort of a cheater's way to go through a bunch of research in a short period of time, but tell you the lessons that we've learned. And I'll be very short on methods, but I'm happy to dig into, Bayesian autoregressive trees, if anybody wants to talk about those, for example. And then if there's time, I will leave time, about 10, 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. I'll talk about where I think this means for the future of science, kind of in this particular space. Now, I cannot go any further as someone who does this sort of work without acknowledging like the team. This is our team. Most of these faces are still around. Some have moved on. There are new faces in. But this is our team at Corners. But more than just our team at Corners, the partnerships we have with a lot of the organizations I mentioned. And just as a case in point, these top two photos are actually our team. We're within in the spaces with our partners 3-4 times a week. Half of our staff are field staff. We're using data in new and innovative ways. We're building data systems. We're engaging in this kind of research. And that's kind of where we are and how we do our work. And again, I'll talk about a little bit of that as we go on. But let me talk about this movement and this moment and broadly define the way a lot of the practitioners in Chicago are talking about it about the creation of a public safety infrastructure or architecture. right? This idea that when it comes to public safety, you need infrastructure. You don't just need, if you think about a city, sewage, you also need transportation, electricity, you need to have schools, you need to have all of these things. And that this is idea about CVI is figuring out how can we do that? Now, most of us, as I had mentioned, remember and very much talk about the 2020 rise in gun violence, but actually in Chicago, there was a larger rise in gun violence in 2016. And this is important because it was in 2016 that Chicago started having some of those conversations around how do we do something different that's not police-centric or criminal justice-centric. Remember, 2016, Laquan McDonald had already been murdered. Rahm Emanuel was on his way out. People were trying to think about new ways of doing things as well. And what they actually did was go back to an old idea. So community violence interventions are more than 100 years old in the city. They date back to the late 1880s and 1890s in settlement houses, and then the 1940s and 50s with the Chicago Area Project and others. They had a very simple idea, which was the people in the community not only know the community better, but they understand the dynamics of violence. And so, by the way, for those of you that know Saul Alinsky, the famous community organizer, he was a street outreach worker, right? He was an individual who was out there organizing, trying to reach individuals. But the core of this model was, again, to look for largely young men who were part of gangs or had lived experiences. They called them detached workers, street outreach workers, curbstone counselors, was to go and meet people where they were who were engaged in delinquency or violence. Because people who are engaged in delinquency and violence then, as in now, tend to avoid all kinds of systems. They avoid schools, hospitals, the police, right? Especially helping institutions. So it's one of those things where even back then, that was still very much true, right? So I even already see in one of the questions, how is this different from Cure Violence? Cure Violence was the public health turn in this space. So these models, Cure Violence didn't invent violence interruption, right? What they did was they shifted the frame from this sort of previous iterations, and then it kind of followed into other models along the way, but they shifted it away from a criminal justice perspective into a public health framework. It's an important change because prior to Cure Violence, a lot of the focus on CVI organizations was actually more about building community capacity writ large. The shift to Cure Violence came to be literally focus on interrupting the transmission of violence, right? So it really focused on one part of what was street outreach, which was let's stop people from shooting or fighting or whatever the case might be. And it actually kept that model alive and actually expanded it during a period that really focused on criminal justice responses. And so we see this lineage going back all these ways. And then we run into a little bit of a tricky thing for researchers, is that the evidence in support of these sorts of interventions is quite mixed. You know, to crudely summarize, this is a paper that came out recently. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it makes things worse. And as a researchers, because of how we focused on impact evaluation, we can't answer why it works, why it doesn't work, when it works, when it doesn't work, and when it makes things worse. There are a lot of ideas, but we actually haven't been able to capture the data to unpack those ideas. But going back to 2016, and here's a picture from 2017 from the South Shore Cultural Center. By the way, I'm tucked away in this picture with a lot less gray in my beard. In 2016, the funding community in Chicago, the violence prevention organizations in Chicago came together to build new ideas, to innovate, and they did a lot of different things. The Institute for Nonviolence was a major player. Ready Chicago and Chicago Cred started integrating sort of individual interventions like cognitive behavioral therapy into outreach. And then you saw a collective of organizations come together, standardized training, standardized pay, to build communication amongst organizations that not only didn't talk to each other, but were often outright antagonistic to each other or in competition with each other. So the idea in 2016 was like, look, this is an old practice. Cure Violence kind of was born here as well. Most recently, we've been doing it for 100 years, but how do we bring that into the current moment? And we saw a lot of programmatic innovation at individual and sort of group levels. And this coordination across organizations was new and novel, which let organizations retain their identity. Some were religious, some were secular, some viewed nonviolence, some viewed on therapeutic interventions, but it lets you retain your identity, but standardize practice and to also understand and coordinate activity. And this is part of what led to this being a movement. They were it, by the way, all of these organizations I'm going to talk about, and it grew steadily over time, even before COVID. Yesterday, they were in Springfield for a massive rally to talk about funding for this space, because to this day, most of the funding still comes from philanthropy and private foundations. The current city budget allocates about 30 million with an M compared to 3 billion with a B, say for policing. But even prior to COVID, and this is really important, these organizations have gone from 12 or so you see in 2017 to having 20 plus organizations that are building an organizational field. The field itself is building what it means to be an outreach worker, to be in communication with your partners across the city, to share information. A lot of that capacity was built on the ground and from the ground up. So much so, and I just mentioned yesterday's rally, but back in February, this is in that same room from that earlier photo, except this time you see more people and the governor and the mayor and the police superintendent all there supporting and applauding these efforts, something we hadn't really seen before. We saw this under the Lightfoot administration as well, but still a relatively new phenomenon, which is to have a movement led by formerly incarcerated individuals, supported by private dollars, receive the standing applause and support of the mayor, the governor, the police superintendent, as well as the county and other resources. So we went from 2016 to having a bunch of organizations that were competing with each other just to exist to 2024, where they're rallying together to try to secure funding for the entire field. That's what I talk about when I'm talking about a blueprint and a movement. Now, how do you research this? Let me just give a little bit of an anecdote. And I know we're on Zoom, but how many of you remember Skype? I'm assuming some of you are laughing, but let's not. I can't do that because don't unmute. But when I was coming back to Chicago in 2016 and 2017, when that was starting to happen, several of those organizations reached out to me because I had worked with them previously and said, look, they want us to do an evaluation. We really don't want to do an evaluation because it's not fair. And in fact, there was this massively important report released by Chicago Beyond, because many of these organizations had been researched, and the relationship between universities and the cities that they are in is not good. And so many of these organizations knew that they were going to be graded on this kind of question and graded fast. And so they wanted to do something different, right? They wanted a partner they had experience with, which was me in this instance, but they also knew, I had done other work and other things, and it had been a couple of years since we worked together. But more importantly, they wanted to push back. They wanted to say, like, look, we understand and we want to know if it works, but we have all these other questions, right? We have all these other questions. How can we do that? How can we understand that? And at the same time, by the way, they had all these questions, but they didn't want to collect data, and they didn't want to kind of engage in sort of, traditional research practices where oftentimes people come in, they do some surveys, they leave, they get some data, they come back, they give you a grade, then somebody takes away your money, right? So they really wanted to be involved in this sort of process, speaking to the realities of the politics of violence prevention. But actually, the realities of gun violence also make it hard to do research in a way that's true to the work itself. And that's really one of the things that we often ignore when we do sort of secondary research on gun violence. Or as we see crime maps, we measure violence in a sort of shape, we see whether it goes up or down, and we say, gee, it worked, or gee, it didn't work. But in reality, the idea of street outreach that I just talked about is very specific. So this is a stylized version of what violence looks like in a city, with two neighborhoods, neighborhood X and neighborhood Y. And all those dots are individuals in those neighborhoods. And some of those dots, the darker ones, are involved with groups: gang A, gang B, gang D, gang E. Sometimes they're gangs, sometimes they're crews, sometimes they're cliques, whatever. And what you see from this visualization is sometimes those nodes are more densely connected to each other, but they have ties to other people. Sometimes they have ties across groups, across neighborhoods. And the interventions around outreach don't just go into a geographic unit and treat the whole unit. You hire, say, an outreach worker, someone with lived experience, because they know somebody in gang A and B, and you're hiring them because they're leveraging those relationships, right? But that doesn't mean they know anybody in gang D or E. And in fact, they might only know people in group A. So if you've got one outreach worker in a city and they only know somebody in gang A and gang A's violence goes down, but B, D, and E goes up, it's going to look like a failure unless you're collecting very precise information, which was not happening. And in fact, was not happening in any of the current research that was going on at the time. To show you this, what it looks like in reality, here's an example of one neighborhood on the west side. It's the exact same thing. The dots here are individuals. The sort of pinkish dots are individuals who have been victimized. And those purple dots are the people that outreach actually work with. What we wanted to convince individuals that were involved in this was like, look, we need to know about those purple dots. We need information on those purple dots. We need to connect them to each other. We need to connect them to other data. We need to think about doing surveys. We need to think about the ways that you're comfortable with that will allow us to understand who you're actually touching and what you're actually doing. And the immediate response was, oh no, we're not doing any information because this information is going to, get to the police. It's going to be used against us, which is fair given the history that we had just talked about. So what we actually did was we took a different approach. And again, the benefit was being present constantly and being in partnership was we created data infrastructures for the organization. And we were able to convince funders that organizations needed support to give them money and computers and data support that was theirs so that they didn't have to exchange, are we going to buy a computer or are we going to hire staff? And we helped them build their own information because data is power, as we know, and a lot of these organizations don't even have their own data. And so we built a system that allowed them to basically develop case management tools that are common in most professions, but we could then use that secondarily to do the sort of work that I'm going to talk about. Not only that, we created a totally inefficient from a data standpoint, but super efficient from a trust standpoint, way to link data that made everybody comfortable, which was organizations were collecting their own data and we helped them craft questions and do all the things. But then we would use their data for our analyses. And to do that, once upon a time, they came to Evanston pre-COVID. We would sit down or we would go to them. We would sit down, do the data linkages in front of them with each other, create an anonymized data set, and then delete everything from our computers so that we walked away with a totally de-identified data set that allowed us to do what we needed to do and still allowed them to retain the power of a case management system, which they realized very quickly for their own internal purposes. And this sort of process of matching and, laborious, like, let's do this, let's do it together, let's do it side by side, actually led to a lot of trust that about 2 years in, people wanted to know all new sorts of things. They wanted to do surveys and focus groups, and they want us to look at spatial stuff, and they wanted to invite us into the field so we could see events. And it opened up all sorts of avenues and all sorts of new questions. And I'm going to give you one very powerful example in a bit that was really led by outreach and opened up all sorts of work in this space. But we went from a talking head on Skype. By the way, I couldn't come to the part about Skype, which I forgot to tell, was I was supposed to be present at a meeting of all of these outreach organizations that came together for the first time, but it was a day I was moving back to Chicago from Connecticut and I couldn't be there. So I was zooming in on Skype, right? The literal opposite of engaged research. I was a detached talking head like I am now. And then so doing it when I got in person, of course, led to these developments. So since then, we've been doing all these different sorts of research. We've got a bunch of papers that are published, a bunch of reports that are published, but I want to talk about the key takeaways from this 5 years of work that we've understood around the creation of this field and this movement. So the first lesson is potentially one of the most significant a lesson that can't be understated, and one that I really think opens up avenues for all other sorts of innovation around services, around community mobilization, which is outreach organizations, these outreach workers can find the right people, by which I mean people who are at the highest risk of being victimized within the near future. There's a lot of science behind this. A lot of my work before I came here was around detecting risk, predicting risk. But when we look at who actually these outreach workers would go out and connect with, their rates of victimization are more than 6 times higher than even individuals in their own community. So if we think about Chicago's level of violence, it's high. When we think about the communities that these interventions are happening in, they're even higher. But when we look at the victimization rates of the individuals that are participants of these organizations, they're 6 times higher than even individuals in their block. By the way, look at that bar chart. Even if you were to get an astronomical 50% reduction in victimization rates, you'd still be 3 to 4 times higher than other people on your block, right? So the level of risk is so severe, and they find them without using the criminal legal system, right? So you're capturing is the wrong word, I apologize. You're reaching individuals in harm's way without a punitive element, and you're doing it at the right time, right? So, we know where violence is going to happen. It hasn't changed in 200 years. And we now know who's potentially in harm's way, and you can reach them in a non-punitive, potentially treatment-focused manner. The second lesson, which goes back to this question that someone asked around cure violence, but also the history, is that this work is a lot more than violence prevention. A lot more than violence prevention. We have a big report that just came out. You can find these next slides kind of in that report. But because we built that data system that I mentioned, where we asked them to track participants and what they were doing, we essentially tracked the involvement of 6,000 participants over 5 years, almost 200,000 contacts. And we asked what each of those contacts were, right? And to go back to sort of this imagery of violence interruption, this sort of violence prevention that people think about, standing between groups that are shooting at each other or creating a non-aggression agreement or de-escalation, that's actually the third most common type of service. If you look at this slide, mentoring and employment are the top, followed by mental health, resource referral, education, social services, housing, and so on. So these outreach organizations are doing so much more. They are thriving community organizations. And we've had a couple of reports that have come out. Others have documented this in other cities. This became really apparent during COVID, especially COVID. So outreach organizations in COVID, remember, not only did gun violence skyrocket during COVID, but outreach organizations were out giving masks, delivering homework to kids. My sister's a school principal in Chicago. She would print out packs of papers, and outreach workers would take it to people's homes, who didn't have internet, groceries, you name it. They were out there kind of doing it without hazard pay, by the way. At the same time, the need for violence prevention was even greater. More than that, the connections they make with participants tend to be very deep and meaningful. That's the number one thing participants report. These data that you're looking at, by the way, were created from focus groups and interviews and observations alongside with our partners and talking about what it meant to participants and outreach workers. Really amazing, amazing work that was going on. But again, if you're thinking about the lessons, you can find individuals that are really hard to find without the punitive method, and you can engage in a whole host of things with individuals who tend not to trust systems for good reason. Lesson 3, and this is an example that I always put out there because when we started doing this work, the people doing the work had a lot of questions about their workforce, and they couldn't answer them. Right? They didn't know how many workers there were in the city of Chicago. They didn't know how old they were. They didn't know if they were men or women. I mean, they knew that they were largely men, but there was no sort of really basic data, let alone science, to understand what that was. And so we created something called the VIEWS survey, the Violence Intervention Worker Study. Yes, there's no E in that, so give me a little bit of liberty. Everybody likes an acronym. And I do need to give a shout out not only to our partners at SUNY Albany who helped with this, but our partners, Chris Patterson and Jalen Arthur at CRED. Sort of at the time, they were both, well, Jalen is still sort of in the CVI space. Chris was at the Institute for Nonviolence. And they were the ones, when we started having these conversations, they wanted to really get all in. And when we first started talking about a survey and we came with our standard questions, the survey was about 30 minutes long. And when Chris and Jalen got done, it was like 90 minutes long. And in fact, these are the big modules we have in our questions: basic descriptions about the workforce. But one of the things that came up very early, which I'm going to talk about today, was exposure to violence, especially on the job. Remember, these are the guys and that are out there trying to stop violence, which means they're exposed to violence, and its impact on the workforce was unknown, but something that people really wanted to know about. Stress, trauma, economic and social well-being. I'm going to try to leave time for questions, but we also have data on some of these economic stuff, which is really difficult to digest and really understands the job. I will tell you, we started this in Chicago. Again, talking about this movement, we had a 93% response rate. Some of you are probably saying 93% response rate. How did you get a 93% response rate? I think I told you that outreach workers are really good at finding people, and the field was invested. And the engaged process was when Chris and Jalen and I would show up, they would understand it was a legitimate survey, not something. And actually that gave us almost a near census. And we replicated this with our partners in Boston and New York. So we have a comparison point, which has been really great. Should also say we're launching Wave 2 this summer. So it's also going to be a longitudinal component on this survey. So who's this workforce? Overwhelmingly men. And I will tell you that this simple descriptive finding has launched great conversations in this space about the role of women outreach workers. There's now developing programs, not just for female outreach workers, but also participants, and the role that they can play in this space, which is deep and powerful. But even having this figure became very, very important for discussions. So that's key. So gender, age. This is a middle-aged workforce. These are 44 years old, largely Black men, as we're going to see in a second, as we're going to see in a second. But by the way, the average age of a gunshot victim in Chicago is 27. So there's about 20 years of gap between the people doing the work and the people engaged in the violence. This has sparked a discussion about whether that's good or bad to have that gap, whether you need people that are younger and can engage in it, or whether people are just saying, okay, boomer, every time you show up on the block. Happy to talk more about that. They're now developing ways to build younger workforce, or to have a greater proportion of younger individuals in the workforce, and what that means. We also don't know whether the 44-year-olds have been doing the job for 10 years or whether they got it at 42. Again, information we didn't have. And I already mentioned this, overwhelmingly Black, which has also led to conversations about Latino outreach workers and developing more Latino capacity, not just in Chicago, but beyond. Going back to the lived experience element, the vast majority in Chicago and Boston had been self-reported in what people would call a gang. Overwhelmingly in New York and Chicago, individuals that have been previously incarcerated. So I'm going to talk a little bit about violence exposure before I wrap up. We've conducted a series of papers that have been published on this, but we did do a piece that kind of summarizes the work in Scientific American. I did not come up with the headline, but it's factually true, which is the punchline is community violence interventionists are exposed to violence at an astronomical level while they're doing a job for which in Chicago they get paid $42,000 a year. 32% of outreach workers in Chicago have seen someone shot in front of them while doing their job. Comparable figure in Boston, slightly lower in New York. 25% of outreach workers has seen someone killed in front of them while doing their job. Similar in Boston, slightly less in New York. 20% of outreach workers have been shot at while doing their job, and 2% have been shot and hit while doing their job. That figure and the shot at is double what it is of a Chicago police officer, which is already high, by the way. So when we think about what they're exposed to, on the job, that's astronomically high. We have a whole paper on the secondary traumatic stress they experience. Punchline, 2/3 of this workforce experience most symptoms of PTSD or secondary traumatic stress. Loss of sleep, sticky thinking, inability to function. We used all the standard scales. It permeates this workforce. I briefly want to talk about, so you have a workforce that's being traumatized while they're doing the work. And by the way, Black and Latino workforce that's being re-traumatized while they're doing this work. Uh, they're getting paid, for many, the first full-time job that they've ever had, with benefits. But what does it look like? And again, when we think about things that add to your stress, here's the average salary in the three cities. Higher in Boston, cost of living, of course, in Boston is off the charts, as it is in New York. In Chicago, the average salary, according to organizations in Chicago, is 42. So, this is a little self-reported, is a little lower, but we see it's roughly in the ballpark. So they're working a 40-hour-a-week full-time job. I want you to keep in mind that this job is not 9 to 5. This is a nights and weekends job. Violence happens between Thursday night and Sunday morning. That's when this workforce works. So they're working a $42,000 a year job with high levels of exposure. And a third of the workforce in Chicago and nearly 60% of the workforce in Boston and New York are working a second job. And they're working more than 20 hours a week at that second job. So this is our workforce that's working 60 plus hours a week. They're tired, they're fatigued, they have stress, secondary stress, they're exposed to violence. By the way, and then we want to know why gun violence, why the programmatic effects might be minimal. They're unable to pay rent, they're struggling to pay utilities. And so this is the workforce. I do want to get to the last lesson and leave time for questions, but I'm happy to come back to some of these findings in a little bit. But, I want to report that this work is having an impact on community and individual level of violence. It's not what policymakers or mayors or governors want to get up. It's not 80% reductions, but it's real tangible impact on people's lives. And so here's the part where when people want to nerd out later, let me know. But we have a paper that's under review right now, and we leverage the sort of growth of this program to create series of synthetic control groups to look at what happened in intervention areas compared to areas that didn't have treatment until that time, or we created synthetic weights. And again, this is a method that's been used in other areas, but really the idea is to compare the groups to places that are comparable statistically through some sort of spatial matching projects. We also eliminated areas just outside the treatment zone to avoid spillover, which is a common problem in this space. So here's the findings. The zero line, of course, means no effect. If you're below the line, it means you had lower level of violence as compared to your comparison group. And if you're a darker purple, it means you had a statistically significant change. Keep in mind, all of this happened during COVID and the ginormous spike in gun violence. And bottom line is 33%. And by the way, each of these dots is one of the different community areas. We don't list them by name publicly. So each one of these dots shows the individual program effect for every one of that gap was part of this movement at the time. And so with, basically all but one went in the right direction, and 33% had statistically significant findings. The fact that only one went in the opposite direction is important because other research saw much higher levels. Research in Baltimore, Philadelphia in particular, saw many more communities getting worse after the intervention. Again, we can't explain why, but it was observed. But here we saw everything mostly in the right directions. And when we put a real number on that, we estimate about 383 fewer homicides and non-fatal shootings than expected, and about 700 or so violent arrests. That's about 7 homicides and shootings a month, which is a lot, actually, for a nascent set of organizations that were kind of building the program as they were going along. So that's a community level intervention. We also looked at an individual level intervention known as Chicago CRED. And this paper was published, I'll give you the results, but Chicago CRED, the model was you have outreach up front where you connect with individuals sort of on the streets outside of sort of, formal settings, and then you bring them in to a phased programming that include a therapeutic environment, cognitive behavioral therapy, other mental health and health related interventions, job educational training, and that after essentially 2 years, you would transition out into a full-time employment or a transitional job and then employment. So again, this was not a sort of a program that's easily amenable to a randomized control trial. So instead, we used a quasi-experimental design where we looked at participants. Also, because it had this phased nature, we were able to look at dosage. Did you make it through programming? Spoiler, attrition is extremely high. And then what we did was we looked statistically to match individuals that looked like the CRED participants within the city as a whole to find statistical comparisons. From a straight one-on-one match to a 1-to-3 match, we could actually do the matching quite well using a series of Bayesian autoregressive trees. To look at this visually again, here is an outreach network I'd mentioned, where the purple are the people that are part of the network. And when we're looking for comparisons, we can actually look at a citywide network, which is extremely large. That includes tens of thousands of people. So tragically, we are not short of individuals that could have been qualified for treatment. In fact, for every one person that was in CRED, there were 10 to 12 people who matched easily in their own neighborhoods who didn't get treatment. So in general, the effects looked like this, which was when we look at all program participants, we saw largely the effect that you wanted on violence victimization and violence outcome combined. When we looked at violent victimization alone, we saw a decline, but not a statistically significant one. And when we looked at violent arrests, we saw a very big and large statistically significant decline, especially for those who completed the program. So it was a bit of a mixed set of findings. We saw a good trend for victimization, right direction, looked like things were improving, but not significant. And yet for arrests, we saw what we expected. And we really wanted to look at this finding to figure out what was going on, because of course, violent victimization is the thing that everybody wanted to see declines in. And there were a couple of key things, and actually our engaged approach allowed us really to look at one-on-one, well, who were the people that failed? Who were the people that got shot again? What do we know about them? What do we know about the case? Is it actually a failure? And in fact, one of the things we saw constantly, which I'm going to come to in a second, was that in many cases, it wasn't quite a failure. But there are other basic reasons that it's the null finding essentially around victimization. One is it's so hard to model gun violence. Statistically rare, it's dynamic, it moves. Victimization moves. And actually, most people were selected to be in CRED because they had just gotten shot. So in fact, what we were modeling was not victimization, but repeat victimization, right? So victimization rates are statistically rare. Secondary victimization is even rare still, and it's actually less than 2%. And so we're modeling this incredibly hard to model dynamic rare event, which explains a lot. There's just not a lot of power to detect significance. But then there's this other element, which is it's actually only part of the community. I had mentioned for every one person, there were 10 to 12 that weren't there. That's really important statistically, but actually in empirically in the real world, it gets described like this. We were teaching individuals in CRED to play defense. They stopped carrying guns. They went to school. They were doing the programs. They were getting treatment, and they got shot while they were waiting for the bus. Is that a program failure, right? Or is that a capacity and scale failure, right? If people are changing the things they can control, like carrying a gun, they can't change the rest of the neighborhood. And as this quote shows, participants described it as playing defense. That was the phrase. We're playing defense, but the rest of the neighborhood is still playing offense. And that was an insight that we only could have gotten, like the Views study, from this kind of engaged approach. So I'm going to stop here after I talk about where I think kind of the field needs to go in this space and where we're hoping to continue to move. The first is something really important, and it's actually baked into the first conversations we had with our partners. Like, we have to measure more than just violence, especially violence as measured by largely police and public health data. What about well-being? What about safety? Like, safety is not just the absence of violence, it's the presence of all these other things. And we don't have measures for that as easily readily available like we do police data. So that's one thing. The second thing, and I'm a sociologist, but it's also very true, centering community practices, actions, and structures. How do we capture that systematically as researchers in ways that are truthful to what the work actually is? Which means expanding our methods, which means not reifying certain types of methods, which often happen to be causal or especially randomized control trials, and thinking about other methods that actually capture what we need to do and can move that narrative forward about the value of those methods and the rigor of those methods, and actually making space for new scholars in this field. Understanding the workforce itself, I've already talked about. It's vital. What are they doing? What are they actually doing? How important is it? How can we understand it? And then I'd already kind of mentioned the idea that this is the field that's developing right now. And rather than just focusing on impact, which we need to do, it's an important question. We also need to understand how this movement and this moment are really kind of taking off. And I'm going to stop there. I'm going to open up the field here. However, I'm going to do that virtually. And thank you all for giving me some time to share this with you today. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Dr. Papachristos, and I want to remind the audience, please use the Q&A function if you have questions for our presenter today. I'll start it off, Indy. I'm curious, we had for our IFAM Population Health Forum about a month ago, one of our speakers was Dr. Simbo Ige, the new health commissioner of CDPH, and I'm curious, she talked a lot about really the need to get upstream and to primary in the spirit of primary prevention of violence, and she talked about shaping structural and social conditions at a community level. Didn't get terribly into specifics at this time, but that's sort of her thinking and the focus she framed for the future of CDPH's efforts. How are you involved in collaborating with CDPH? How are they involved in the activities that you talked about today?
That's a great question. I'm going to give two answers to it, and I'll expand a little bit on it. So I should say we are externally funded from CDPH. We secured funding to assess whether CDPH's money is going where it should go. Right. So there was some city funds to the tune of about $20 million through CDPH that went to some of these community organizations to hire, to staff, to expand. And so we actually have a report that'll be due out any day on that. The punchline is basically the same as what I showed you. Actually, when the money gets to the organizations, they can reach the right people. They can do the right things. The two things I want to say about sort of the here and now triage versus looking downstream, and I don't know, but I assume, having been in these spaces, that many people on this call, especially in public health, know it's all of these things: primary, secondary, and tertiary. So we need to do all of them at the same time. Let me start by saying something that's a little bit more controversial and potentially bold, but investing in CBI organizations is investing in structural causes. You are funding organizations that hire Black and Latino individuals that have lived experience, have been previously incarcerated, and you are building institutions in communities that are doing much more than just stopping shootings. I've shown that, I've proven that. That's very, very, very important. And so we need to do more of that, right? If you want to hire formerly incarcerated individuals, that's what they're doing. And that creates a sort of effect around them and their families, by the way, which is part of the things we're trying to capture in that space. And I think that that's very important to understand. I also think, tangibly, there are other ways we could be doing that, which includes improving schools, investment, businesses, not to mention things like gerrymandering, which take away powers from community. But when we look at the average participant, I had alluded to this, but they're 27 years old. And when we look at the CRED participants, 2/3 have kids. And so, in fact, when you're treating the 27-year-old, often their children go untreated, their services, or whatever the case might be. So there also needs to be a shift to youngers, to systems, family systems, school systems. And we're starting to see some interesting innovation in that space as well. But I do think that oftentimes this root causes versus here and now trade-off is is something that's a bit of a political element, and we have to do both. Like, anybody who says we don't have to do both, they're trying to get funding for whatever it is they're doing. We got to do both. And I'll give you an example in the gun space. I didn't talk a lot about guns. Like, decreasing the demand for guns is one thing, but we also got to work on supply side issues. How do we regulate? How do we, what are the interventions that will actually work? It's the same sort of thing. What are the upstream, as well as downstream costs? And I actually think the public health framing of this, it does this well in other spaces, thinking about what that looks like. David Hemingway, Daniel Webster, Garen Wintermew, there are a lot of folks in this space that have done this. And I think that's kind of an important pivot and shift in terms of where we need to go as a city and a country.
There's a question in the Q&A from Corey Bradley, and I think this alludes to your last slide and sort of the future, and specifically Corey's asking about field of implementation science and dissemination science, and whether that can provide some additional methodology to deepen how we understand and learn about community violence and community violence interruption initiatives, and also as a field that's evolving in itself, how can we learn? Because you gave several great examples today of field-based work that's really teaching us how to think about, and you described doing research in a very different way that builds trust and helps to understand a problem fundamentally.
Thanks, Corey, for that question. So I'm right on the fence on if we're there yet, but clearly the need for implementation science, and I talked with Renaud and others about this, we're right there, right? We still can't answer what the intervention is, right? I think that's part of the problem in this space. We've had a couple of programs that have been, a handful, 3, that have been subjected to sort of research that allows us to say, for example, with our study on CRED, we're able to differentiate sort of dosage, and we're able to show where the impact is most felt. But at the same time, we don't know why people drop out. Attrition is half. And we don't understand which elements yet are quite there. So we're just beginning that. The READY evaluation, which just came out, and our results are comparable, which is great. 2 studies, different methods, same cities, same findings. They counted participation as showing up for one session with 60% attrition. And so still, they're right there at the nudge of starting to say, like, here are a couple of programs of things we know work, but the implementation science element is there. And in fact, some of the replications of cure violence, that was the main critique, was they never actually replicated the model correctly. But the model was never subjected to really understanding things like dosage or timing or attrition. So I think the field needs to move in that direction. I think it'll be greatly beneficial. In particular, what I really love about the implementation science space is how you do it in different contexts. And this is one of the key things that's talked about a lot. I had mentioned the difference between men and women. There's a huge difference between how you intervene in Black communities and Latino communities in Chicago. And those 2 things alone warrant a lot more investigation, let alone what it's like to intervene in a city that's not Chicago. Because all these programs start in Chicago and LA, but most cities are Rochester, Buffalo, New Haven, Hartford, Cincinnati. And so smaller cities are very different and actually more typical. And we need to understand that. And I spent a lot of time in smaller cities on the East Coast, and even in Evanston, which has similar problems, the scale is minuscule. In New Haven, you were talking 12 families, 300 individuals. Compared to Chicago, you're talking about 20,000 individuals, 900 gangs, right? And so I think the movement there needs to kind of go towards that kind of space. So I think that's a great question.
We have another question that popped in, really asking what the correlation is between decrease in unemployment or more jobs and an increase in educational attainment with community violence.
Yeah, that's a really great, complicated question. Let me give you the aggregate answer and then the individual answer. The aggregate answer is crime rates don't always vary like you think they would with unemployment rates, which is, they plummeted as unemployment rates increased, in certain areas. Crime rates tend to go up during recessions and things like that. But it's really complicated in the aggregate. At the individual level, employment and education are the 2 things that actually keep you the safest, in the long term, right? So transitioning to transitional jobs, this idea that you provide someone a job for a short period of time and they work very well when you have the job, right? And education is one of the clearest ways to reduce recidivism and future victimization at an individual level. And this comes back to that paradox about how we think about, it's an ecological fallacy. Most poor people don't kill anybody, right? And in fact, I didn't talk about this today, but my previous research on networks showed that it's less than 1% of any community that's driving a violence. And everybody in the community is largely sharing the exposure to violence. They're largely homogenous on race, So poverty is super complicated and it's horrible on everything else. But when it comes to gunshot victimization, It's this, how do you navigate between the small percentage that are creating dynamics? And so when we look at people that are coming into cred or ready or CP4P, the sort of the gaps and opportunities in learning are huge, right? Literacy levels are low, previous job experiences are low. So getting them to where they need to be to get employment or education, it costs a lot of money, by the way. And it takes a long time for a 27-year-old to deal with 27 years of trauma and the trauma of incarceration and to get back on track in school. It takes years. So it's a long-term investment, but it's worth it. It's just really complicated. And poverty is not good for anything. But the relationship is really tricky because most poor folks don't shoot anybody, but they're suffering in lots of other spaces and ways.
Well, we're at the end of the hour. I think first I'd like to thank you, Andrew, for coming back again and sharing this work with us. And now in your new role as IPR director, it's really great to have you and to listen to your work. I think at a content level, it's a topic that is of incredible importance to all of us, and it I think for the people on the call today, there are several that work in this space, and then a lot of others who wonder how they can contribute. And you gave us some ideas of the future, but maybe you can leave us in a minute with if people wanted to connect or engage or get involved, what would be the best way that they could do that?
Well, the first thing I would say, and this goes back to that slide I had showed about why am I always being researched, is I would take a long moment of pause and think about, how and why you want to get involved. And, down on your campus, you have ARC. There are ways to do community engaged research that you need to understand and respect because, and I don't know anybody, I can't see anybody in this call, I can't see your names. But one of the things that's really important is you don't go into a neighborhood and mess it up. Like some of us shouldn't leave the lab, period, full stop. You can help in all kinds of ways. You can donate time, you can donate money, you can vote. But if you actually want to get involved in community engaged research, you need to understand what that entails. And let me just tell you what shoe leather, a lot of it, the ability to take punches and not get defensive, the ability to wrestle with your own biases and privileges. And I'm someone who I don't ever share this in the community spaces unless we're at a different relationship, but I have personal experiences with gun violence. It doesn't erase any privilege I have as a sort of white cis man. And if I start with that defensiveness, I'm not going anywhere. And I also need to understand the role of your institution, and Northwestern in particular. I went to graduate school at the University of Chicago. I worked at Yale. Those two institutions' relationships with the community are horrific. Northwestern's is not great. It's often just absent. And so, thinking about that baggage as you go into a neighborhood is vital. And then understanding the methods. And when we talk about things like, someone had asked a methods question earlier, but randomization, that's a great textbook thing that never plays out. There has never been a gun violence program that has randomized neighborhoods in Chicago. They go to the same neighborhoods over and over and over and over again. And so understanding the politics of that is also vitally important. And I think that that's kind of, some key things and understanding what sharing actually looks like. There's one final challenge, which is the incentives for young scholars to get into this space is low because of the traditional burdens in academia, publishing in particular journals and getting grants and peer reviews and all those things. Like community engaged research takes so much time, and it doesn't lead to immediate high impact publications, which is important. We need the papers to be out there, but that timeline is different than a grant cycle or an election cycle or a cycle of an organization who's trying to keep their lights on and understand impact, right? Like I'm more excited about that 383 number than I am my H index. I'm also totally well secure in my career, but like those are things that when I think about where you have impact and the scale of it's a little different. So there's lots of resources. Feel free to contact me if people want to know about players on campus that are doing this and doing it well. I'm happy to kind of point you in that direction.
Wonderful. Thank you again, Dr. Papachristos. We appreciate you and for your presentation today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Ron. Thanks,
Take care.
everybody.